One of the things that I learned quickly in talking with David Vladeck, who is one of our keynote speakers today, is that he brings to to a lot of these issues a tremendous sense of historic context. He understands how this has happened in many industries before, and it's one of the things that I wanted to talk to him about. David Vladeck is a professor of law at Georgetown, but before that, he was the director for several years at the Bureau of Consumer Protection at the FTC, where he oversaw hundreds of people working on a lot of the issues that we're talking about today. And as I said, sees a lot of this with, I think, a great sense of context. And as we start thinking about the ways in which, as I think the last panel discussed, we may start seeing increasingly blended solutions to a lot of these problems, especially regarding data privacy and consumers. Understanding how this has evolved in other industries, I think, is important. Let me start. Welcome, David. Thank you very much for being here.
Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah. Let's start with I know security and breaches of security are one of the things that are of great concern to you. Tell us where you see us, especially in the digital landscape, in terms of the level of securities that you see in the market now, and where the greatest areas of concern are when it comes to security of consumer data.
So, data breaches are now a daily fact of life. According to, and I pulled out some statistics because I find them so fascinating, according to the Industry Financial Services Roundtable, which represents the banks, in 2014, about 110 million Americans had their financial data exposed. So if anyone in this room thinks that they weren't subject to a data breach, you got another in the last few years, you're probably wrong. So data breach is ubiquitous, and the harms that flow from data breach are often sort of unappreciated, but they're real. So one of the problems with data breach is that it's very difficult to sort of trace harm directly to a breach, partly because we've all suffered so many of them. But if you look at identity theft has risen in lockstep with data breaches. Identity theft is the debris of the digital economy. Last year, in 2014, which is the last year I have statistics for, the FTC received about 1/3 complaints for identity theft. 1/3. We estimate that's 1/10, maybe 1/20 of the actual number of people who suffered identity theft. Now, that is an enormous burden to place on people. I don't know whether any of you have suffered it, but you file police reports, you have to put on credit freezes, credit markets, and of course, none of that protects against the loss of really personal information. No credit freeze is going to help the people in the Ashley Madison breach who found their marriages dissolve. It's not going to help people who were prescribed Prozac and had their names revealed by Eli Lilly. So there are real harms from data breach. We don't see them manifest necessarily immediately, but they're real. Let me just give you one last statistic. According to the Department of Justice, and their statistics lag behind, so I'm now talking about 2012. In 2012, the financial loss from identity theft totaled over $25 billion. Okay, that's a lot of money, and let me give you a comparison. So compared to all property crimes, robbery, arson, vandalism, the harm from data breach was almost twice as much. So these are real harms. They're being felt in the marketplace. They're very difficult to attribute to a particular data breach, but people are starting to push back. And I think Bob Gelman pointed out that if you look at the most recent surveys, people are starting to be very worried about the digital economy and the impact it's having on their lives.
So I have a two-part question in response to that. First of all, I know you mentioned attribution is one of the problems here. So where are we in terms of understanding where the leakage really is occurring, so we can really locate it? And what's the state of regulation on data in terms of these specific questions?
So that's the perfect question to ask, because the fact is we really don't know where the leakage is occurring. So consumer-facing companies, when they lose data, are subject to data breach notification laws, right? You've probably gotten them in the mail. If you are Target or one of the others. But most of the companies that are not consumer-facing don't really have those obligations. So if you ask me, how many data breaches are there a year in the United States? I don't know. No government official knows, and that fact is at the moment unknowable. So you ask, where's the data leakage coming from? Is it coming from the companies represented in this room? Is it coming from the big box stores? We know a slice of it because of state data breach notification laws, but we don't have the full picture. If you look at the Financial Roundtable, the Services Roundtable report, their estimate is based only on data breaches that have been publicly reported. And so it's very difficult to get the landscape. We know that there are, there are dark sites on the internet where there are auctions 24 hours a day selling credit card information, social security information, medical ID information. So there's a robust market for personal information.
Well, then, where is the FTC starting then in trying to unravel this? Because somebody, obviously the consumers are starting to demand it. They're feeling this very personally,
right?
And they're starting to demand it through their legislatures for some sort of action on this. So where is the FTC starting in trying to locate the problem?
Well, remember the FTC has only a slice of our nation's economy, so we don't represent the financial services organizations. We have jurisdiction over some of the other components, but our authority is really limited to making sure that companies have adequate data security practices. And so the agency, I think to date, has brought somewhere between 55 and 60 cases against companies that had data security that was far weaker than that the market would suggest is commensurate with the sensitivity and the volume of data that they hold, right? We do lots more investigations. So not every data breach necessarily generates a case by the FTC. In fact, it's the inverse of that. Most of the data breaches the agency represents, this was a sophisticated hack, or the company had reasonably robust defenses that were overcome. There's going to be no such thing as perfect security. We understand that. Other than that, we have been pushing for best practices, but the agency doesn't have statutory authority to write rules in this area or to do anything other than sort of after-the-fact investigations in hope that the orders that we impose are some form of deterrent. Remember also, the agency generally doesn't have finding authority. So even in the most egregious breach, the agency can put the company under order and worry and try to deter future breaches. But there's nothing the agency can do to protect consumers or to remedy sort of what's already taken place.
There are some enormous data brokerages, though, out there now,
right,
who a lot of people in this room deal with. A lot of digital advertising is reliant on.
Right.
Where do you see in terms of regulation and FTC authority over these large data brokerages that are collecting enormous amounts of profiling data that's being used in a lot of different ways?
Right, and Acxiom has thousands and thousands of data points on everybody in this room, and these are very robust, unfortunately error-prone, but nonetheless robust profiles on each of us. So since 2010, the agency has called for legislation that would do a number of things. One is it would give consumers a right to see what the data broker has that relates directly to that person, right? Because if you look at the FTC's data broker report, which was issued in 2013, one of the concerns is this data is used not just for marketing purposes, but it's being used for all sorts of other purposes, including underwriting. And the data, by and large, is bad. There are tons of errors in it. So that's one problem, and one prophylaxis is to give consumers at least a right to see what it is the companies are reporting about them. Second, the agency took the position that there ought to be scalable correction rights. That is, when the information is being made to make consequential decisions about you, insurance, employment, some of the FIC recovered, you ought to have at least some right of correction. And third is that there has to be some way that consumers can interact with these non-consumer facing companies. Everybody in this room has dealt with companies like Acxiom. Most Americans have some vague fear, actually, that there are these big databases out there, but they don't know the names of the companies, they don't know how to access them. The data brokers are sort of the credit reporting agencies of our modern times, but they're not regulated like credit reporting agencies.
Since you mentioned profiling, and I want to pick up a theme on our last panel about how complex profiling gets and where it starts touching upon things like civil liberties themselves, where we see profiles that are used to discriminate in terms of not only pricing, but the ways in which people are qualified or disqualified for certain benefits. We're getting to a point where the profiling has become so dense and mining of data has become so sophisticated that a set of presumptions can be made, or at least many marketers think they can be made, and companies think they can be made about consumers. Can you talk a little bit about that intersection of civil rights and data mining and where we stand in that?
Well, if you look at the profiles that are offered by data brokers, they are very specific about things like race, gender, age, socioeconomic condition. If you want a database that consists only of Spanish-speaking urban residents who've been in the United States for fewer than 10 years and live in a certain household in a certain area, you can get it. Now, one has to ask, why does someone want that information? And if you look at payday lenders, if you look at other subprime lenders, those are the people they're targeting. And that raises serious questions. So the FTC just did a panel on lead generators. Now, you all know what lead generators are. If you look at the information streams that go into certain lead generation activities, it's pretty clear what's going on. So one is that the robustness of the data broker data allows the segmentation based on factors that, at least under some of our laws, give rise to concerns. So ECOA, the Equal Credit Opportunity Act, does forbid certain kinds of discrimination in lending. And so one concern is that now that marketers can buy these highly segmented lists, incredibly segmented lists, is there anything necessarily improper about how they're going about selling their products? Are they making offers that can't be justified by some other basis to Hispanic communities, to black communities, that might differ in some qualitative way than they're making to suburban white communities? So one question is raised by the increasing ability of data brokers to segment their markets however a customer wants. The other concern, of course, is the tools that are being used to make decisions, which are machine learning algorithms that are very hard to get a handle on from a regulator's perspective about what happens. You know the inputs. Because the algorithm changes based on the data that's being fed into it, there's no opportunity for transparency about how these decisions are made, and then you're really left with studying the outputs. Now, I'm not all in favor of human making decisions. We're biased, we have poor decisional tools, we often misread data. So it's not, I don't have a sense that having computers help us is necessarily, we're heading in the wrong direction. But from a regulator standpoint, the way underwriting is done these days, using very complicated algorithms that change based on the inputs that they get, make a regulator's job very difficult. Because, even if you understand the inputs, there are thousands of these inputs. Some of them may or may not be proxies for suspected classes.
Right, when you have machine learning, the algorithm is actually changing in ways that are outside of the control of any individual that could be held culpable.
Well, no, we can hold the individuals culpable. The problem is, you can't, people have tried, but the argument is, I didn't do it, my machine did it. That's not an argument that's gonna get past a regulator. The problem is proving that the outputs sort of are discriminatory in the way that the statutes prohibit, and that's complicated.
Let me ask a question. It actually came up today again. It's come up throughout the 10 years that I've been covering privacy online, and that is that digital is being dealt with by a different standard from what preceded it. That, bank redlining of neighborhoods for loans has gone on for a long time. That direct mail, for instance, has targeted and shared and swapped data. Credit card companies have swapped data with one another, have swapped data for years. That one of the arguments is that digital is being held to a higher standard than what came before.
I think that's an unsustainable argument. I mean, look, redlining has been illegal since for 45 years at least, right? It's easier to find when a bank engages in redlining. All you do is need a map and pins. And I mean, I've done these kinds of cases. One of the first cases I worked on as a law student was the first criminal case against a renter for engaging in racial discrimination. And we had a map of New York and we had little pins. Computers didn't exist then. This is back when they invented dirt. This is a long time ago. Now the problem that regulators have is if you're engaging in redlining, you're not going to be stupid enough to just simply, okay, zip plus 4, if you're in one zip plus 4 will give you X. If you're in zip plus 4 in another place, we'll give you X minus 6. Doesn't work that way anymore. The factors that go into underwriting are much more complex. They're much harder to tease out. And instead of looking at inputs, which is the way we went after discrimination in the marketplace beforehand, we have to look at outputs. And that is very hard. When I was at the FTC, one of the few disparate impact cases we brought was against a lender who masked the differentials in pricing. This was a mortgage lender, not with APR or anything that was easy to tease out, but with certain add-on fees. And so I actually think digital is getting an easier ride than its predecessors.
Let me move on. Maybe for Q&A, okay. We can leave some of that for Q&A too, because there's still a question of direct mail too, and some of the ways in which data was shared across in direct mail.
Yes, but those mailing lists were so much less robust than the information that we have now.
Okay. Let me ask about in terms of consumer awareness, consumer sensitivities. Right. There seems to be a disconnect, or at least there always has been, between attitudinal surveys of how sensitive consumers say they are about privacy, and their actual online behaviors in terms of how much control they take over their data when it's made available to them, the ways in which they really, the levels at which they really do opt out when given the opportunity. This seems to be a persistent question in digital marketing and data collection over what the consumers really want and need from the industry, what they say they want, at least in the abstract, when asked general abstract questions about how sensitive they are about privacy, as opposed to how they actually interact with companies and take the opportunity.
Right. I think industry is just plain delusional about this. If you look at consumer surveys, consumers are worried about the digital economy. Chapman University puts out an annual What America Fears Most, and two things are in the top 5. Corporate misuse of their data and online tracking. And if you look at consumer surveys, they repeatedly report consumers are distressed about this. Consumers are also resigned because most of the choices they get are take it or leave it choices. And opt-out mechanisms, by and large, are designed by people making them very difficult to read. Privacy notices are the original sin. They have nothing to do with privacy. But if you look at studies, people look at privacy and say, oh, okay, there's a privacy policy. Companies must care about my privacy. They're not privacy policies. They're data sharing policies. They're written by lawyers. I just think that, and if you talk to other regulators, you'll get the same response, which is we haven't given consumers usable controls that really allow them to opt out of what they don't want to be. And this is the discussion about do not track. One of the reasons why Jules's request, which is really you turn do not track into an opt-out cookie that will prevent you from getting behavioral ads, that was never really the issue. It's not that people are worried about the behavioral ads, they're worried about the accretion of personal information about everything they do, which is why the agency is holding, or just held, a workshop on cross-platform tracking. If you go talk to people, they are very frustrated with the way the digital economy works. And look, this coupled with the steep rise in identity theft, which can be matched to the expansion of the digital economy, if I were in this industry, I would try to tease out better how to respond to consumers' concerns. If not just for us, it's because the rest of the world is clamping down on this.
Do we know anything about how better to, or do you have any ideas, or have you seen better examples of how to communicate this to consumers so that they do engage more forcefully? Because on the ground, they're still ignoring a lot of those. I mean, they're not even seeing a lot of the ad choices options. They can click on them and they can go into it.
Ad choices. And the choice is, do you get behavioral ads or not whether they're collecting your information. That is, again, you're talking about ad choices. What most consumers are talking about is the collection of their information.
Data, I have one last question I want to open up to questions, and this is the historical contextualization. As we look at the ways in which regulation has evolved in other industries, how can we use that as a sort of a precursor or a preamble to what you think we're likely going to see when it comes to digital data?
I think Congress is so deadlocked that to the extent there is going to be regulation, it's going to come from the states. And I think there are states like California, Texas, which actually regulates fairly strictly the use of facial recognition technology, Illinois, maybe New York. You're going to see state regulation. Why? Because people are concerned about this. And so ultimately, I think that the people in the digital space are going to confront a very difficult question, which is, can you tolerate conflicting state laws that regulate your industry, or would you be better off with the national law that Congress enacts? I think over time, and I'm not talking about months, I'm talking about years, ultimately there will be federal regulation here, because the alternative, which is a balkanized set of regulatory tools enacted by states, is going to be unacceptable to the industry. You're going to see that with facial recognition. There are already 3 or 4 states that have facial recognition laws. They're not at all similar. More states are considering them. Data broker legislation is going to be enacted in a few states, I think, within the next few years. You have this odd coalition on data brokers. You have the libertarians and you have the liberals. And collectively, you can get to a majority in many states if you patch that sort of coalition together. So people forget just how new this industry is for people who work in it. I'm sure it feels like an eternity, but it's a decade old. And it takes regulators and legislators time to react, but they will start to react, and at some point soon you'll see increasingly state legislatures taking up these issues. Why? Because outside of California, this isn't like auto dealers. It's not like there's a digital advertiser in every district in the country. There are places where you're going to see regulation, and just as we saw with environmental regulation, started in California, occupational safety and health regulation started in New York and Pennsylvania, you'll ultimately see the industry clamoring for some kind of steady state federal regulation of the industry.
And it sounds like from the examples that you gave, it may not be this sort of low-level data collection on the part of targeted advertising that triggers this so much as higher level and more obvious and high-profile instances of data breaches, or things like facial recognition that really seem to be triggers for regulating the general issue of data.
Right, or one data breach by a company like Acxiom, and people are going to ask, where did they get that data? So I think that there are many possible triggers, but I think this will be slow, steady cuts, state legislatures, so there are progressives in Oregon, there are progressives in Washington state. There are states where these issues are taking root, and it's not going to be next year, but it will be down the road. And so, it's in one sense, the failure of do not track, I think, ultimately will down to the industry's detriment. I think if you're talking seriously about giving consumers choice, give them that choice. Now, of course, do not track was a cookie bait. We're moving past all of that technologically. I get all that, but that's really sort of what is at the core. And I think at some point there will be regulation.
Let me open it up to questions.
Here you go.
Hi, Joe Mandisi from Media Post. So I just went on Acxiom's site about the data, and I registered 6 pieces of data. They know I'm a man, I'm an adult, and they have bad information about my household interests. That's not 1,000 data points. So
No. Acxiom is not showing you everything they have, and they make no representation that that's all they have on.
Oh, okay. So where's the compliance then?
I'm sorry?
I thought you said that the legislation has been passed that would require them to disclose?
I did not say that. Legislation has not been passed. What I said was that the Federal Trade Commission has called for that kind of legislation for 10 years. Acxiom has made the first step in enabling consumers, and I think this is highly problematic because they show you a few things, and like your experience, some of the most basic things turn out to be wrong.
Right.
I've been married for, don't tell my wife this, but I can't remember, it's been like 30 years or something. According to Acxiom, I'm not married, I don't have 2 kids, which is going to come as a huge surprise to them.
Yeah, I just wanted to make one point. You can go to LexisNexis and get your report, and there are definitely 1,000 data points on there. And they'll give it to you for free, and you'll be surprised at what's in there.
But LexisNexis less data than a company like Acxiom. It has a different business model than Acxiom does. So they have 1,000 data points on you. I suspect Acxiom has far more for most of the people in this room.
Let me, if we don't have another question, I want to round out with a final question about native advertising. Because one of the latest releases from the FTC is their guide for native advertising. Is this a precursor to regulation? Is regulation of publishing the appearance of advertising in digital channels inevitable?
So yes, it is a precursor to enforcement. If you look at what the agency did on the same day, it put out 2 documents. One is a guide to business, which sort of is follow these rules and we'll let you alone. And then they also put out a 15-page single-space enforcement guide, which is basically taking a knife out and saying, do this or else. The agency has always worried about native advertising. Why? Because the whole theory of native advertising is to trick people into thinking that this isn't an advertisement. And so when I was at the agency, we did a lot of cases against companies that were engaged in what they thought was permissible native advertising. Fake news sites, ad networks that were using, all sorts of, TV imagery and so forth. On one day, we shut down 10 of the affiliate marketers in 2 huge ad networks that were using a lot of, quote, native advertising. So this is an issue that the agency has always felt keenly about. Yes, there are increasing efforts for native advertising. The New York Times, if you look at it digitally, in the middle of its front page digitally, has basically a whole sort of linear column of native ads. And so the agency, I think, is trying to explain to business what the rules are. You've got to be completely transparent that this is an ad and not an article. And I suspect that the agency will give the community 6 months to get its house in order, and then they will go after and bring enforcement cases against people who don't.
David Vladeck, thank you very much.
I actually have a quick question.
We're going to break for lunch. Lunch, I believe, is going to be served in back, out in the hallway. We'll have a lunch and learn session shortly. Ken, did you have an announcement?